Hi everyone, welcome back. We're in session 2 of our course on In Defense of the Resurrection, and tonight's session is on the empty tomb accounts. But before we get to that, by way of review, recall this course is a historical look at the resurrection itself. It's additional information over and above what we already know that are contained in the inspired writings of the New Testament accounts. And last week we talked about this idea, or answered the question or made the statement, why does the resurrection matter? And we looked at the historical levels to evaluate various stories with. If you remember, we looked at asking the question, what are the sources? What are the dates? Are there eyewitnesses present? And we applied that to various scenarios, including that writing that we know as the received text in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. The reason that's so important historically is that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians about 25 years after the resurrection itself. So it's the first mention in writing of that monumental event. And so tonight we look at the empty tomb account, sort of with that same lens of looking at sources, dates, and eyewitnesses relative to these specific accounts, the empty tomb accounts in the Gospels. In addition, tonight we also look at some very unique details present in these empty tomb accounts. So if you look on page 23 and 24 of your workbook, kind of walk through what the sources are of the Gospels themselves. And we know that two of the writers, Matthew and John, were actual apostles that walked with Jesus, whereby Mark and Luke were informed by others, Peter and Paul, and write about their experiences, their words relative to those Gospels. I've kind of given you a chart and breakdown top of page 24 on what those sources will be, and we'll leave that for your further study. As we begin to look at these empty tomb accounts, I've divided the stories into three different sections. One is the approach to the tomb. The second is the arrival to the tomb, and the last one being the departure from the tomb. And I've listed for you the verses that are broken down in that particular category. And hopefully you'll have time to read each of those stories. And the idea would be to kind of look at each of the stories and compare and look for similarities and differences between each of those segments of the stories. And I've got charts on each of those pages that kind of outline what came across to me as I read the text. You may have others, and you can just write those in or add those as well. Pages 27 and 28, I've listed out the textual similarities of the empty tomb story. And then on page 28, the textual differences in those stories. And I think one of the questions is, does it matter that there are some differences present in each of those stories? And I would argue that the differences actually add authenticity and credibility to the stories themselves. And you'll kind of see that fleshed out as this session progresses. There are also some areas on page 28 of your workbook on the uniqueness of the empty tomb story that are different from many of the other stories. One is that women play such a prominent role in this particular story. And why is that important? Well, of course, in first century, women were not accepted as legal witnesses. And if you were to write a story such as the empty tomb story, people would not include women in those stories if it weren't true. So I think that's an important point. We also see, and I've got listed for you some other areas at the bottom of page 28 and 29 that talks about some of the uniqueness of this story, and I'll leave that to your discretion for reading. But the better part of the remaining session is really looking at the main arguments favoring the empty tomb itself. One being what we just mentioned, that women were the first witness to discover the empty tomb. And many scholars believe that is significant in the whole resurrection debate or the historical argument for the resurrection. And interestingly, all four Gospels do record women discovering the empty tomb. Second on that list is what's called the Jerusalem effect. Think about this, where Christianity arose out of Jerusalem, not far from where Jesus was actually had been placed. And it would have been no difficulty for someone to walk over and look in the tomb to see if it were indeed empty. But no one apparently thought that was necessary. But we do call that the Jerusalem effect, where the life, the teaching, and the Christ stories arose very close to the empty tomb itself. We also see that this story was multi-attested or multiply attested, which is an important historical point, that not just one person was talking about it, but we have four accounts in the Gospels that stated that. And typically, two or more sources in agreement during ancient times rendered really that fact or that statement almost indisputable. And so here we have, in this particular case, four different individuals attesting to the empty tomb. As we move on into D, we see some of the early, what's called pre-Pauline creedal traditions, or the received text, implying the empty tomb. In other words, last week when we talked about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, it implies that there was an empty tomb present. And we could also say that about the teachings of Peter and Paul in their sermons in the book of Acts, where the empty tomb is implied in their gospel message. And the rest of this on pages 30 and 31, you can kind of work through on the importance of the empty tomb stories. So I've got some important concluding points from this particular session, that the truth of the empty tomb story rests on the historical reliability of these gospel accounts, their sources, dates, and eyewitnesses present, and the unique details. Secondly, that the differences in the textual accounts of the empty tomb do not mean errors, but imperfect corroboration among the Gospels actually adds credibility and authenticity to the account themselves. And there are strong and credible arguments for the empty tomb that do exist, and I think historically is powerful layer of information that we have from a historical standpoint to add to what we already have regarding the received text. So with that, I'll leave it with you to study and read, and all the best, and maybe see you next week. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.